Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think I want to give a general overview of what the book is about and hopefully entice you to read it and digest some of its contents. I think the title gives you a pretty good idea. It's quite a grandiose title, 10 Women Who Changed Science and the World. We started out thinking this would be a great title and we finished it thinking it would be a great title. These women were remarkable women. They did do an incredible amount for science and for society. But I think we also want to get across the idea that this is a celebration of science in general and women's roles in science. And there's a definite sense of revelation. Many of their stories were a revelation to both Rodri and I. We're both long-standing scientists in our field. And I'm ashamed to say that I think only 2 of the women on our list, our final list, I really knew very much about. And that's one thing that I want to get across today is this revealing of these amazing women and their stories. And I was reminded of that. I was in Chelsea and Westminster Hospital last week, and they are undertaking a new project to reveal the nurses who've worked in the hospital, female nurses, and they've got a fantastic set of photographs of 50 women. But nobody knows anything about the story behind them and why they were such a success and how they made the hospital successful. And I think for these women, it was very much a case of maybe you'd heard of their names, but did you know anything about the stories behind them? We certainly didn't. So it's really about celebrating the women and also revealing what it takes to be successful in science. And I think now I would extend that and say what it takes to be successful in all fields, because they have to work so hard to succeed. It gives a real indication of what's necessary to be a success in your field. So my name is Catherine Whitlock. The book is co-authored with Rodri Evans, and it was published in the UK February this year and in the US in June. So where do we start? There are 10 women. I think they're all fascinating. I loved all their stories for different reasons, but I'd just like to start by highlighting one lady, Rita Levi-Montalcini. I don't know if anyone in the room has heard of her? No. She was an Italian doctor, trained as a doctor, but very early on developed a fascination with the nervous system and how it develops. And in particular, she works with a pathologist, Giuseppe Levi, who was an absolute tyrant to work for, but he taught her the most amazing set of skills. She learned how to create slides where she stained cells of the nervous system and monitored how they developed over time. And this through decades, and I mean decades of work, and that's a common thread through all these women's stories, how long it took. She described and discovered the first growth factor. So these are molecules that drive the development of immature organisms from a single cell all the way through to the complex resulting organism. And nerve growth factor was the very first growth factor to be discovered. She discovered it in 1952. And it really, the whole field exploded after this first discovery, and there are 4 different categories. There are hundreds of them. I think that it's an ongoing list. And I think what's important about her, well, she lived a long time, 103 years, definite longevity award there, but that was more down to luck than anything else, I think, although she had her own theories as to why she lived so long. But also, she had a very interesting take on life. She was the only one of our 10 scientists who wrote an autobiography. And I love the title of this because it kind of sums up life in general and life in science. Science is not a perfect art or science. It is a whole imperfect process, and she was the first person to admit this. She spent a lot of her career going off down a particular track and finding it really was going nowhere and going off somewhere else. So she wryly recognised this in the title of her autobiography, In Praise of Imperfection. So one of the fascinating things about her is the circumstances of her life. So she was born into a Jewish family and did a lot of her work, or was starting out in her work, in fascist Italy. She had huge difficulty getting an education. Again, this was a very, very common story. Women were not encouraged to have a career. They were not encouraged to be educated. And that's a worldwide issue at the time. We're talking about the 1920s into the 1930s, and I'll come back to the dates in a minute. But she did eventually get a place at medical school. She was one of, I think there was something like 5% of women in her medical class. So she was already fighting at every turn. Her family were enthusiastic, her mother in particular, her father less so. He had a viewpoint that getting an education as a woman meant that you hadn't had a successful marriage, which was an interesting take on the situation. But she persevered, and I think one of the stories I love about her is fascist Italy. She had to give up her work and move up into the hills with her family to escape the problems for a Jewish family, and in particular a Jewish woman trying to work. And she set up a lab in her bedroom and used all sorts of, she was working on chick embryos at the time because they provide a very easy way to study the immune system, the nervous system. And she found all sorts of ways of getting hold of eggs, working on them. She made her own incubator with the help of her brother. She ground her own operating tools on a grindstone using sewing needles. She approached the local ophthalmologist for forceps. She was very, very ingenious in her ways of setting up her lab. She also had the help of her mother, who stood at the door and barred anyone from entering while she was doing all these important experiments. And not only did she get some amazing results, and we tell the process of how she discovered nerve growth factor in the book, but at the end of the experiments, bearing in mind this is war-torn Italy with very scarce food supplies, she insisted that the whole family ate the eggs, which didn't go, the resulting eggs, but didn't go down very well, but they did it nonetheless. So she lived until she was 103, and I think the second photograph here on the right, she worked with mice a lot. That was one of her big research tools. Another lovely story about her, she wanted to use a particular strain of mice, and this shows you the time she was working in. They didn't have it in America where she needed to take it, so she didn't hesitate about popping one in her pocket and taking it over on the plane to America. Wasn't detected, and she carried on regardless. Like many of these women, she had a very strong humanitarian streak. So later in life, when she was still actively involved in research, she set up a foundation to promote education for girls in Africa. She was always very conscious of her beginnings and how difficult it was for her to get an education and to work. So she was always pushing the boundaries, involving everyone in her lab and anyone she knew in the causes that she supported. And in fact, she became such a public figure that towards the end of her life, when she was still working pretty much up till the day she died, people in Italy would say that nobody would recognise the Pope unless he was standing next to Rita. She was such a public figure. So a lovely story, a very involved story, and lots of detail about that in the book. So just to come back to our list, this is a busy slide, but I just want to highlight a few key characteristics about the women we chose. They were multinational, a certain number of American, but we also tried to include Europeans, and Cheng Sheng-Wu was born in China, so an international flavour. They were born within 50 years of each other, and in particular, the vast majority of them were born in the 12 years between 1906 and 1918. Now that's very significant because they were basically born at a time in the post-Industrial Revolution, a huge blossoming in technology and interest in science and the applications of science. And also from a historical point of view, and we try to bring this out in the book as much as possible, they lived through times of great change. So Europe in particular, the First and Second World War, and in America, the Great Depression, which again created extra problems for many of these women. If there were any jobs, they were going to the men. So those factors sort of run through a thread through all their stories. And the other thing we tried to do is bring bring in, we only had 10. We made a conscious decision to only have 10 scientists so we could go into some detail. But we also tried to include lots of different areas. So there are scientists who are biologists, chemists, physicists, and medics. And I think one of the reasons that became increasingly clear as to why we wanted to do that is if you talk to women who are in science now, one of the many things that would make a difference to their scientific lives is having mentors, is having people to look up to. And also, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious there are lots of different ways to do science. And these women, although they lived in much less technological times, they showed that there are many different ways to do it and many different ways to get into science. And that's something that we've tried to bring out in their stories. So just to pick up on some of the threads that run through the book, this is Dorothy Hodgkin. She was a British scientist who some of you may have heard of, but she's very famous for working in X-ray crystallography and working out the structures of very important biological molecules. She worked in the UK for most of her life in Oxford and Cambridge. And she, like many of these women, was inspired from an early age. And often it was the mothers that provided the push or the inspiration. Sometimes because they felt they hadn't had an education themselves and they were desperate for their girls and their children in general to follow their passions. And so Dorothy Hodgkin was very inspired by her family, her mother, and the circumstances in which she lived. And I'll come back to that in a bit more detail. The other thing that inspired several of the women, particularly those who worked in medical or chemical fields in the pharmaceutical industry, they were inspired by tragedies, family tragedies, deaths, often from preventable causes, in the days before antibiotics, in the days before any sort of treatment for cancer. So Gertrude Elion lost her grandfather to cancer. Virginia Apcar lost her fiancé to a preventable bacterial infection of the heart, endocarditis, preventable nowadays with antibiotics. And so these women there were several tragedies that run through these women's stories. So inspiration was there in the early family life and the drive to succeed that their mothers often pushed. But also, I think, again reveals the power of inspiration from mentors. So several of these women went to university and well, all of them went to university somehow or other, but they were inspired by the people around them that ignited some kind of spark. And in fact, just to sort of jump forward to their later life, not all of the women had children, not all of the women were married. Many of them had some kind of family commitments, whether they were looking after an aged relative or adopting their niece's son, these kind of stories. But they felt very much that they wanted to work and have their family life at the same time. There was a constant theme of parallel lives and how do we get them intertwined. It's a perennial problem that we still have today. And I think Dorothy Hodgkin, there are some lovely quotes from people that worked with her. Jenny Klusko, who was one of her research students, said after Dorothy died, one of the things I admired about her most is that she always put her children first when they were there. She didn't fuss around the house, she put them first. And then she moved on and went back to her science. She had this kind of incredible ability to flip very quickly from some crisis at home to a crisis in the lab. And I think, you know, that sense of focus was something that she really highlighted. So collaboration is a huge part of science, even more so nowadays. You look at any research paper, there are hundreds of names on it. These massive genome projects, there's so many people involved. But even in these days, all these women had some kind of, or many of them had some kind of strong collaboration. And they vary quite a lot in how those partnerships, if you like to call them that, worked. When I showed someone this slide yesterday, they said, they're all men, the partners. And afterwards I thought, yes, I probably could have found one or two that had women, but unfortunately there weren't any photographs, so the bias here is a bit unfortunate. Marie Curie was, of course, married to her partner in science. And that was a very interesting partnership because they were clearly deeply in love, but they also had a huge and a huge passion for their science that they shared. And what that meant was that although they could exchange ideas on a constant daily basis, they also had a kind of reciprocal energy. So when one was slightly diminished in their enthusiasm, the other would gear them up. And it became a hugely productive partnership. George Hitchings and Gertrude Elion worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and it was really their research that is partly responsible for the large success of Burroughs Wellcome and the offshoot here, Wellcome Trust in London, because they found a novel way of developing new drugs, a kind of methodical design, which we go into a little bit of detail on in the book. But they were one of the long-standing partnerships, and in fact, if you look at the Nobel Prize website, they are highlighted as one of the couples that worked most productively together for 23 years. And he actually employed her, and she eventually moved into his position when he retired. But even the story about that process is interesting, because this is where the kind of serendipity of science and circumstances in life comes in. Gertrude's father was a dentist, and she was having great difficulty finding a job when she qualified from university. It was at the time of the Great Depression in America. And he happened to notice on one of the painkillers he was routinely using in the surgery the name Burroughs Wellcome. He said, "Why don't you ring them up and see if they can get you a job?" Sure enough, she did, and it just happened to be at exactly the right moment where they were looking for somebody. She presented herself as a very knowledgeable and capable woman and was snapped up. Although at the time of her interview, there was one other woman working in the lab who clearly was not happy about the prospect of some competition and made very derogatory comments about what she was wearing and that they weren't suitable for the lab. So, you know, women's support wasn't always there. But nevertheless, they're a highly successful partnership and very much complementary working styles. And she was much more fiery and intuitive. He was the methodical, let's get through hundreds of experiments. And they worked together in a fantastic way. Rita Levi Montalcini, here she is again, getting towards the end of her life here. She worked with Victor Hamburger, who was a neurologist, a developmental neurobiologist who worked in America. So this was a transatlantic collaboration, and they both spent time working in each other's labs and had a very long, friendship and very productive working life. And then Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner. Now this is a much less, I don't want to use the word successful, but a much harder relationship, because they initially worked together in Nazi Germany, and she was also Jewish, and we go into some detail in the book about the story, but in essence she left it right till the last minute to flee and only just managed to escape with her life to Copenhagen. And it was while she was there that she was contacted by Otto Hahn. They worked in atomic physics, so they were trying to understand what happens to the structure of the atom and how it breaks down. I'll come back to this later, but she eventually got to the bottom of why their experiments weren't working and what the problems were. But he never acknowledged her input, and in fact he was awarded the Nobel Prize for their work, and she was not recognised. And so that, I think, deeply affected her, and she was a shy woman. She found it difficult to cope with this treatment of her. But they did eventually make it up in some way towards the end of her life. So different kinds of partnerships, some more productive than others, but a very important part of science for them and for today's scientists. So I've just written this here, thinkers and polymaths. I think it's connected. They worked in a very different time in science. There were huge difficulties in training and working, but they also had a weird kind of freedom. Everything took a long time. So there was years and years and years to process their results, to think about things. Many of these women were working out of the establishment. They were doing things differently, often on their own, sometimes with collaborators. But I've worked in science for years, and I know what it's like nowadays, the difficulties in getting grants, in justifying your research, case impact studies, where is it going, why is it important? Now, many of these women were working in very important areas, but they didn't have quite the same pressures as to justifying their research. So I think, there were many difficulties, but there was also a sense of freedom. And I think the other thing is that many of them were polymaths. That's not a word that you use nowadays about today's scientists. You look back at someone like Darwin, who had all sorts of interests and brought all kind of thought processes and slants to the way he did his science. Nowadays, science is very specialised. It has to be, it's because it's so complex in many areas. But these women often thought out of the box and did things differently. There are a couple of examples I'd just like to illustrate. Virginia Apgar was a medic who qualified in 1933 in the United States. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Apgar technique. Yeah, one or two nods. Any parent who stood at the birth of their child should have heard the Apgar technique being used. She really pioneered not only women in medicine in the United States, but also the field of anaesthetic obstetrics. And one of the many features about her, and again shared by several of the women, is the painstaking and continuous attention to detail and interest and curiosity. And what she observed over a number of years of being in the delivery room is, and I find this incredible now, that women were the focus of the attention of the medics in the room and the nurses. The babies were, to quite a large extent, not exactly ignored, but they weren't the focus. And it suddenly became clear to her that some of the early neonatal deaths and problems later in life could be rectified if there was a lot more focus on the baby. And this came to the fore. She was sitting in the canteen one day, and obviously all these thoughts were milling around in her head, had been for years. And a student said to her, but you're worrying about these newborn babies. How can we improve their well-being and their health going forward in life? And she suddenly just jotted down on a piece of paper 5 key signs to look for, things like muscle tone, how they're breathing. They're 5 simple characteristics that are really quite obvious when you think about it, and you score them, end up with a score out of 10, two for each of the 5 characteristics. And so a baby that's born with a score of 8 or 9 doesn't really require any particular attention. If it's lower than that, then you start thinking about using oxygen and so on. And that technique is now used, I think, worldwide. It certainly is here in the UK in all delivery rooms. And it's been developed, Atul Gawande, the US surgeon, has now developed a similar score for adults for looking at surgical outcomes. And although she had no intention of using it as a data collection tool, it has been used in longitudinal studies to show that babies that are born with low scores are more likely to have problems later in life with developmental issues. But she also, so she was an amazing woman, very curious, always interested in teaching and imparting her knowledge and moving the field forward. And she did a lot of work with congenital disorders, particularly on a sociological point of view of making sure that these babies were recognised and cherished. But she also had this fascination with music and musical instruments, and there's a lovely story that we include about her called the phone booth caper, and I think this story partly reflects her ability to do things slightly differently, and there are elements of it that shouldn't be repeated at home, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. So she not only played musical instruments, several instruments, viola, violin, cello, so on, but she made them. And the phone booth caper story describes how one day she was in the hospital foyer and her friend said to her, "Have you seen that piece of wood in the telephone box?" And sure enough, there was a shelf in the telephone box made of this beautiful maple. Quite why they were using it in a telephone box, I don't know. And she suddenly realised that she could use it for the back of one of her violas, one of her creations. And so she politely asked the hospital, could she have this wood? She would replace it with something else. And they firmly said no. But she was undeterred. She was always undeterred by people saying no. And so later that week, one night, her and her friend snuck into the hospital, took the piece of wood, replaced it with a almost identical replica and something much cheaper, and she duly took it home and turned it into this beautiful instrument. So it was a story that emerged some decades later, so I don't think she actually got into trouble for it, but a lovely indicator of how she was prepared to do things a bit differently. And I think that flipped over into her research. So Another favourite of mine, Dorothy Hodgkin. So we've talked about her already. She had a family. She was married to an academic. She had 3 children. And what she's most well known for from a scientific point of view, there's a lot of her life that she's well known for, but from the science point of view, she worked in a field called X-ray crystallography. And very simply, this is where you grow crystals of, in her case, complex biological molecules like penicillin or insulin. And you fire X-rays through them. Whoops. And this results in what's called a diffraction pattern. Depending on the layout of the atoms, you'll get a pattern that reflects back onto the X-ray paper. And from that, you can draw up an electron density map, electrons being one of the subatomic particles of any particular element. And by a process that's called fitting here, which I think is an unfortunate term, but what it really means is that you by very complex mathematical analysis that she did by hand, this is in the days before computers, months and months of work, you turn it into a model of the biological molecule. And that's particularly important nowadays when you need to do structural analysis of how receptors fit into molecules, and also in the case of penicillin, creating synthetic models of it. So here she is here, celebrated on a stamp with the model of insulin, I think it is. So one of the things that, coming back to the polymath and this kind of intuitive understanding, a lot of people who work with Dorothy said that she had an amazing ability to kind of see the structure from these flat images. You know, bearing in mind this is a very simple one, but these are multi-atom models are generated. And one of the things that's they think explains it, and I think she probably thought this herself, is that she was brought up in Egypt. Her father was posted out there for his work, or she spent some of her early life in Egypt, and he was a classicist by training. And she spent a lot of time examining and recording in great detail these lovely drawings, the patterns in mosaics that they found in Egyptian sites of antiquity. And she and her colleagues put that experience, that interest, that polymath approach to life, looking at different things, down to that's how she managed to interpret these complex patterns. She had this understanding of how molecules could fit together from her archaeological work. A lot of persistence in very difficult conditions. Persistence was the name of the game for many of these women. And Marie Curie doesn't need much introduction. I've just used her as one of the examples to illustrate the difficult working conditions. I think anyone's ever been near a lab, or anyone who's had anything to do with health and safety in a lab, would be absolutely horrified to look at these pictures. You know, here she is holding what's quite possibly a vial of radioactive material. No gloves on, no white coats. Very, very difficult conditions they often worked in. Cramped, cold, hot, not the right equipment. And she and her husband were a prime example of that. I mean, as you know, they described the process of radioactivity in great detail. It was discovered by Becquerel in 1895. And then in particular, her and her husband isolated and identified 2 new elements, polonium, named after her native Poland, and then radium. And I think, you know, the horror of the working conditions of those times, I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I think there were both physical problems. Many of the other women's stories reflect this kind of thing, perhaps not such an extreme way. And actually, I think I'd just like to read one short passage from the book, because I think in the case of radium and the difficulties of working with it, everyone was so taken up by this amazing new material that health and safety and any thoughts of the effects on their health were just ignored, really, even by these highly intelligent people. So as radium was being isolated, the world was falling in love with this strange substance. It was assumed that a substance that gave off such a lovely glow must be good for you, and radium quickly became a cure-all. Some bought radium-enhanced water, while radium salts were sewn into performers' costumes to glow in the dark. In Paris, a Montmartre review was entitled Medusa's Radium, And in San Francisco, a production featured, and the review says, fancy unison movements by 80 pretty but invisible girls, tripping noiselessly about in an absolutely darkened theatre, and yet glowingly illuminated in spots by reason of the chemical mixture upon their costumes. Radium was painted onto the faces of watches and clocks, and one company even brought out a radium lipstick. As yet, no one realised the harm the substance could do, but Marie and Pierre were already feeling its ill effects. Pierre's hands became so damaged from handling radium that he had difficulty dressing himself. His bones ached, and he walked like a man 20 or 30 years older. Marie, too, was often weak. So, it seems very strange that nobody made any connection at the time. Subsequently, people did start to make connections, and there were all sorts of court cases of women who'd been damaged working in factories where radium was handled. And in fact, this is an extreme example of terrible working conditions, but effectively it did kill both of them. She died from the long-term effects of being exposed to radium. And Pierre was very tragically knocked over by a hansom cab one day in Paris, probably because he was so unsteady on his feet that he sort of slipped off the curve, and it crushed his skull, and he died instantly. So, pretty extreme examples of terrible working conditions. And it always surprises me that Marie did have two children. Whether there are any long-term effects to them, I don't know. That's not something we explored. And I think the other thing, while we're talking about working conditions, the other thing that I was really struck by was the personal circumstances of some of these women and their difficulty once they were married. So Dorothy Hodgkin is a good example, working here in the UK. In the 1930s, and this applied in other countries as well, you basically had to give up work when you got married. That was it. It was pretty much a legal obligation. So much so that I think something like 12% of married women worked outside the home. And the marriage bar wasn't actually removed in the UK in teaching in the civil service until 1944 and 46, respectively. It's not that long ago. So you get married as a woman, you can't work anymore. I just find that incredible. And Dorothy Hodgkin did a lot of work on this, and also she had a big part to play in statutory maternity pay, because again, that didn't come in until the 1970s in the UK as a legal requirement. But she was the first woman in Oxford to receive some level of maternity pay, and that's probably because by the time she had children, she was already getting some recognition for her work. So, pretty difficult working conditions, but these women were all pioneers, and I think, despite their difficulties in getting an education, in working in these difficult environments, sometimes they made a rod for their own back. Elsie Widdowson was one of the pioneers in nutrition here in the UK, and she was a great one for self-experimentation. Again, not something to try at home. So here she is injecting herself with trace amounts of things like strontium, which is used in various medical treatments. It's present in toothpaste and so on. Her and her colleague, McCann, were most well known actually in the field of nutrition for developing a composition of foods table, which is still used today. So any particular food, the precise compositions of it. But she was also very interested in understanding how the body processes food. And in this particular case, they fell foul of their own experiments. Her and McCann were injecting themselves with this stuff one day, and they ran out of a pure preparation. So they hurriedly sterilised, or so they thought, another preparation, only to find that it was contaminated with bacterial toxins. And they really only survived because one of their colleagues found them collapsed on the floor of their laboratory. So, pretty extreme. And she was also a pioneer in developing the wartime diet. Her and McCann spent a lot of time working out the minimum number of nutrients, amount of nutrients you needed to survive. And they tested this by going hill walking. Here she is, all dressed up, hill walking in Cumbria to see if they could survive on wartime rations. So many of these women were pioneers, difficult working conditions. They learned how to persevere, to be absolutely to push forward the boundaries of what they were doing. But many of them also had quite ill health. And Henrietta Leavitt, I haven't mentioned her yet, but she was an astronomer known as the Star Fiend, and she measured the magnitude of stars and developed a system of working out the distance between stars such that we understand much more about the scale of the universe and how it's gradually expanding. And the information on her was more scarce than some of the other scientists because there was not much recorded about her life. But what we do know is that she had prolonged periods of absences for ill health. But she was such a phenomenal scientist that this was accepted, and she would come back to her projects after having left them for 2 or 3 years. Did a lot of work with the Harvard Observatory in America. Dorothy Hodgkin again. This is a portrait by Maggie Hamling that's here in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And I think this is a phenomenal portrait because it demonstrates so much about her life. So she was diagnosed at the age of 28 with rheumatoid arthritis that gradually became worse to the extent that you can see her here, her hands were very crippled. But even here in her 70s, she's still working. And Maggie Hamling has portrayed her with 2 pairs of hands. She never had enough hands to do what she wanted to do. And so there's this sense of this frenzied activity despite her disability. And harping back to working conditions, she often got people to adapt the equipment in the lab so she could carry on working. And here she is with all her books and publications and part of the molecule of insulin, the model of insulin, and a half-eaten sandwich on her desk. So she pushed on regardless, and rheumatoid arthritis did eventually get the better of her, but she was still working and travelling right till the end. And that travelling is important for her because she was a huge humanitarian, and she is credited with keeping the lines of communication open between the US and the UK and Russia in the beginning of the Cold War. So quite a remarkable woman. Rachel Carson, we haven't talked much about her, but she probably is one of the names that you may recognise from the list. She wrote a series of books about the sea, and her background actually was in English. She majored in English, so she was a beautiful writer. So she was one of the scientists that had a slightly different way of doing science. She was a researcher, she did work in marine biology, but her real the defining characteristic really of her work was how beautifully she wrote. And she here is being interviewed pretty much on her deathbed, or you wouldn't think it to look at her. So her final book, which is the one that she's most famous for, Silent Spring, describes the effects of the pesticide DDT on the environment. And she had been diagnosed with breast cancer a few years previously, and it had come back. And I think this is a matter of months before she died, and she's wearing a wig and was speaking very quietly. She was a very quiet but persistent character. Somebody once said she spoke so softly you could hardly hear what she was saying, but what she was saying meant she could not be moved. She was like the Rock of Gibraltar. She was she knew her own mind, but she was not going to be noisy about it. And she unfortunately died just after Silent Spring was published, and at the time was battling both the American government and the chemical industry in the States, because nobody was prepared to accept what she was saying. But the message did eventually get through, and DDT is mainly banned across the world, and she's credited with starting the environmental music movement. So very powerful character. So final point really, many of these scientists, or we realise now how important the social context of science is. And Lise Meitner her story really highlights this. So her and Otto Hahn, who did receive the Nobel Prize for their work, described in great detail how if you take atoms of uranium and you bombard them with one of the subatomic particles, a neutron, you get 2 fragments breaking away, barium and krypton. And what's most important is the vast amount of energy that's generated from this process. So this is nuclear fission. And this is the science behind the atomic bombs. And she was always described as the mother of the bomb, and she was horrified by this. she was interested in the science, she was interested in atomic physics, nuclear physics. She wanted to understand the properties of these materials and these curious phenomena. And she was asked to work on the Manhattan Project in America. And when she realised where this was going, she point blank refused. And of course, not long afterwards, the research led to these bombs and huge thousands of deaths. So understanding where science is going and the implications of what you do is now a massive part of science. But many of these women at the time didn't realise what would happen from their science, and this is a very good example. So I just want to finish by saying we were fascinated by their stories, their science, the intertwining of their lives and the historical background to their science. But I think it also reveals how important diverse scientists and revealing how these women have contributed, but we need to carry on doing this. And I'm really heartened to see that we've now got, for the first time in its entire history, I think, a female editor-in-chief of the Nature magazine, and she's really pushing research into this field and trying to encourage diversity in science across all fields. And there are some lovely stories that are now up on the Nature website. And I've also highlighted at the bottom there women in immunology, because that's my field. And I think there's probably a book out there to cover women in immunology. But I think that's all. Thank you very much for listening.